chosen one while the entire community sits in stunned silence, jaws dropped in disbelief as if this collapse came out of nowhere. You're sitting back with that quiet, knowing look, the same look you had months ago when you already saw this coming. They called you paranoid, too intense, dramatic, someone who reads too much into things. But now the brutal truth they can't swallow is staring them dead in the face. You weren't predicting the future. You were simply awake, the only one who dared to see the signs while they played pretend with their eyes wide open and minds shut tight. Your gift has always been your ability to decode life at levels others don't even realize exist. While they were entertained by surface performances, you were tuned into the unspoken, sensing the shift in energy, the tension in the silence, the inconsistency behind every word. You paid attention to what wasn't being said, to the pauses that screamed louder than the speeches, to the subtle but telling changes in behavior. Where others were fooled by confidence, charm, and noise, you saw the cracks in the mask. You've lived through enough, lost enough, and been lied to enough to recognize when something just doesn't fit, no matter how polished it appears. This isn't paranoia, it's refined pattern recognition. And though you may not have realized it at the time, 3 distinct revelations were surfacing within you, aligning in ways that would eventually explode into clarity. First was the personal, understanding that your sensitivity, once treated as a flaw, was actually a finely tuned radar. Second was social, seeing that what masqueraded as community was often just well-rehearsed performance. And third, the most shattering, was systemic, recognizing that anything built on denial and illusion doesn't just weaken over time, it disintegrates completely. You grasped a truth that many still resist. Momentum is not the same as stability. While they were busy clapping for appearances, you were quietly studying the structure. While they celebrated the message, you examined the motive. And while they lost themselves in the noise, you stayed grounded enough to hear the cracks beneath it all. The moment you spoke up, everything changed. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right before they were ready. And when truth arrives too early, people don't just ignore it, they try to destroy it. You became the problem simply by being honest. The backlash came in layers, mockery behind your back, sarcasm to your face, jokes that were never really jokes. You spoke out of genuine concern, but they treated your voice like a threat. Still, deep down, they felt what you felt. They just weren't ready to face it. So instead of confronting the discomfort, they made you the scapegoat. This chapter of your awakening taught you the loneliness that comes with seeing too much too soon. You were already standing in tomorrow while they were still celebrating yesterday's illusion. Every interaction became exhausting, trying to explain storm clouds to people addicted to sunshine, warning of foundational cracks to those obsessed with fresh paint. It's always easier for them to mock the messenger than accept the message. Easier to laugh than to listen. Easier to label you as overly emotional than to admit you might be right. And so, they clung to their illusions, desperately hoping your voice was just noise. Because if you were right, everything they believed in would begin to crumble. But you were never chasing attention. And you certainly weren't trying to play the prophet. You were simply refusing to stay blind in a world where everyone else treated denial like a sacred ritual. The hardest part wasn't that you were right. It was that you never wanted to be. You didn't crave chaos or secretly wish for anyone's downfall. You spoke up because your intuition wouldn't let you stay silent, because your soul couldn't lie to itself the way others seemed to do so effortlessly. While they clung desperately to the comforting narratives they wanted to believe, you made the painful choice to accept what was actually unfolding right in front of you. And that kind of clarity, it comes with a steep price. It costs comfort. It costs relationships. Sometimes it costs your own peace. Because once you've seen the truth, once the veil is lifted, there's no way to return to ignorance. You can't unsee the manipulation, the counterfeit loyalty, the scripts people recite to keep themselves and others comfortably asleep. And when you tried to share what you saw, you weren't received with gratitude. You were labeled the pessimist, the one ruining the moment with inconvenient truths. During this time, a powerful shift was taking place deep within you. Your internal compass was quietly realigning, learning how to detect the difference between authentic connection and performative bonding. It wasn't a skill you sought to develop. It was a survival instinct born from too many encounters with masks and emotional mirages. You weren't trying to tear down anyone or anything. You were trying to prevent a collapse that only you seemed able to see with painful clarity. You were the lighthouse in the storm, trying to steer ships away from disaster, but they mistook your beam for a threat to their course. You were branded the problem, the disruption, the danger, when in truth you were the warning flare trying to protect what mattered. They called you the fire, not realizing you were trying to prevent one from consuming everything they cared about. As time passed, you began to feel what they couldn't yet name. A slow, invisible rot set in long before any visible decay. The vibrancy faded, replaced by something artificial. What once felt alive now felt rehearsed. Genuine excitement turned hollow. Smiles tightened. Praise lost its warmth. The room, once electric, now felt heavy and distant, as if the air itself knew something was dying. But no one wanted to admit it. They were still curating perfect moments while the truth eroded beneath the surface. And you, while they were still clinging to illusions, you were already grieving. Grieving what it used to be. You had witnessed the fire in their eyes dim into performance. You had mourned the loss of realness while they were still clapping for the show. And when the collapse finally came, you didn't flinch. You didn't react with shock or outrage. You had already carried the emotional weight of this ending in silence long before they were ready to even admit something was wrong. This is the moment your second transformation began, not in rebellion, but in retreat. You stopped speaking, not because you had nothing left to say, but because you finally understood your truth was not safe in their hands. Every time you tried to speak honestly, your words were twisted, repackaged, and used against you. They weren't listening to understand. They were listening to find weapons. So you embraced strategic silence, not out of fear, but from hard-earned wisdom. You came to understand that protecting your truth sometimes means holding it sacred, keeping it close, rather than offering it up to those who only seek to dissect, distort, or destroy it. Your silence, once mistaken for surrender, became louder than any argument ever could. It was the moment you stopped craving to be understood, and instead began preparing for the storm you knew was on its way. People noticed when your voice faded from the conversation. They assumed you'd run out of things to say, that you'd lost your edge. But what they didn't realize was that your silence was an act of power, your way of reclaiming control in a world where your words had become ammunition for others. And while they continued to misunderstand you, another revelation took shape within you. Your role was never to convince. It was to stay rooted while the world around you unraveled and learned through experience. This wasn't about proving a point. It was about being spiritually and emotionally prepared. Every person who disregarded your warnings was unknowingly excusing themselves from the future you were quietly constructing. Even in your quiet, you were building something profound. While they clung to their illusions and performed unity for the crowd, you were finding others like you, souls who had also seen behind the mask. You found your tribe, not a group that agreed on every detail, but one united by a devotion to truth over convenience, clarity over conformity. These weren't the ones who clapped from the sidelines when it was fashionable to do so. These were warriors, individuals who would rise beside you when rising meant risking something. You learned to separate the ones who wanted real change from the ones who just wanted a front-row seat to the drama. The Watchers loved the spectacle of rebellion, as long as it didn't require their name, their presence, or their sacrifice. But the warriors stepped forward when it mattered most. They didn't flinch when the pressure mounted. They knew that real builders don't need spectators. They need other builders, other visionaries who are willing to get their hands dirty to birth something real. During this phase of your awakening, you witnessed something even more piercing than the mockery or the rejection. You watched loyalty mutate into leverage. What once looked like solidarity and shared purpose began to reveal itself as calculated strategy. People weren't standing by each other because they believed in something higher. They were forming alliances because it felt safe, profitable, or politically convenient. And when the winds shifted, so did their allegiance. Not because of growth, not because of revelation, but because of pure self-interest. They called it evolution, but your spirit recognized it for what it was: opportunism in its most disguised form. You could feel it in the subtle changes, the way they spoke in guarded half-truths, the way they kept just enough distance to escape responsibility if things fell apart. But calling it out would have made you look bitter or paranoid. So instead, you observed in silence as people revealed their true loyalties, not when things were easy, but when standing firm would cost them something. That's when you realized some people were never loyal to truth, to mission, or to you. They were only loyal to comfort. And when that comfort was threatened, so was their character. This awareness collided with something even deeper and far more disturbing. The community you once believed in, the circle you thought you were safe within, began to show its true form. What had appeared to be genuine connection now resembled elaborate theater. There were scripts behind the smiles, costumes behind the personas, and rehearsed applause behind every so-called breakthrough. The deeper you looked, the more layers you uncovered. There were hidden power structures masked as equality, secret competitions pretending to be collaborations, and subtle manipulations disguised as guidance. People weren't connecting soul to soul. They were networking, profile to profile, like brands at a convention. Every gathering started to feel like a marketplace, where the only thing anyone was truly selling was a polished version of themselves. And in that space, authenticity didn't just disappear, it was exiled. You began to see the patterns with unmistakable clarity, how conversations started sounding scripted, how certain phrases were repeated like chants to maintain the illusion of unity. Words that once held sacred meaning, like growth, authentic, and community, had been hollowed out and weaponized. They had become little more than brand slogans, tossed around to market a lifestyle rather than embody a truth. When people spoke of transformation, what they really meant was a more polished social media persona. When they talked about healing, it wasn't about depth or wholeness. It was about packaging their pain into a product. But the most unsettling realization wasn't the hollow language. It was how disagreement had been turned into a pathology. To question the narrative wasn't just seen as wrong. It was treated as toxic, negative, and out of alignment. No one debated dissent, they diagnosed it. Anyone who dared to think critically or explore nuance was labeled resistant to growth. You watched in quiet heartbreak as intelligent souls trained themselves out of their own discernment, afraid that too much depth would exile them from the only community they thought they had. And that's when the most devastating truth hit you. What you believed to be a community was nothing more than a beautifully staged costume party. At first it looked like purpose, like unity, like a tribe moving together in truth. But the longer you stayed, the more the curtain pulled back. The support felt forced, mechanical. Compliments were delivered with rehearsed enthusiasm, but only when others were watching. Praise became performance. Applause became currency. What had been presented as an authentic collective was really an audition room, where everyone played a role to keep the illusion alive. You started to see that love was no longer unconditional. It was transactional. People weren't valued for their heart or integrity, but for their reach, their clout, their usefulness. Relationships weren't rooted in trust, but in exposure. Visibility replaced vulnerability. Connection took a back seat to convenience. And if you didn't play by the rules, if you refused to put on the costume and read from their script, you were quietly erased. Not because you were wrong, but because your authenticity disrupted the illusion. This place that once felt like family revealed itself to be a marketplace. Loyalty had a price. Praise came with strings, and the moment you stopped feeding the image, you vanished. Not because you lost your value, but because you no longer fit the narrative they were selling. That's what cut the deepest. Not just the loss, but the betrayal. Because you had shown up real, you had cared, you had believed in the mission. You had poured your soul into something you thought was sacred. But your authenticity had become raw material, used to fuel a machine that polished sincerity into content, that transformed your truth into a carefully edited brand. Your vulnerability became their credibility. Your insights were repackaged and paraded as their wisdom. Your growth, your hard-earned transformation was commodified into their success story. You weren't part of a community. You were a resource, mined and repurposed. This awakening brought with it a loneliness that pierced deeper than just isolation. It was the kind of aloneness that arises when you realize you've been surrounded by people who've forgotten what real connection even feels like. They had traded authenticity for applause, depth for validation, soul for strategy. And once you saw that exchange clearly, you couldn't unsee it. You already knew the game was rigged, but this was something else. This wasn't just about a broken system. It was about the heartbreak of discovering that what you thought was love, what you thought was unity, was simply performance. Quick pause, family. If this message is resonating with your soul and you'd love to support this sacred work, feel free to buy me a coffee. It helps keep this space flowing with truth, light, and divine clarity. The link is in the description. And if you're feeling it, drop number 88 in the comments to let me know you're here walking this journey too. Let's keep going. Around this same time, another pattern began to crystallize. One you could no longer ignore. The individuals who had positioned themselves as leaders weren't leading at all. They were feeding off the energy, attention, and trust of those who truly wanted transformation. Their decisions weren't driven by purpose or vision. They were carefully calculated to maintain their spotlight, to keep themselves at the center of admiration and influence. Every passionate speech, every grand vision, every so-called call to action was less about elevating others and more about preserving their own ego. You saw how they surrounded themselves with people who would never challenge them, how they engineered spaces where dissent was unwelcome. A single question was enough to get someone cast out, not because the question was wrong, but because it threatened the illusion they were working so hard to maintain. What the world saw as leadership was nothing more than performance art. And what looked like wisdom was a script, recycled phrases, catchy mantras, and hollow declarations crafted to win applause without offering any real substance. They had mastered the illusion of depth. Their words danced beautifully in the air but landed nowhere meaningful. They spoke of transformation, but never allowed anything fundamental to truly shift, because real change would mean giving up the very pedestal their identity depended on. You began to see the deeper game. Crises were manufactured to maintain their relevance. They created problems only to position themselves as the savior, manipulating narratives so they always appeared to be the solution to the chaos they subtly orchestrated. It was a loop of drama and salvation, keeping followers emotionally addicted, spiritually confused, and constantly in need of guidance. Through shared outrage, fabricated urgency, and emotional volatility, they manufactured intimacy. They trauma-bonded with their followers, creating the illusion of closeness by tapping into unresolved wounds and presenting themselves as the only ones who could understand or heal them. But the most sinister revelation came when you noticed how they weaponized sincerity. They preyed on the genuine desires of seekers, people earnestly committed to growth and self-discovery. They took that sacred hunger and twisted it into spiritual consumerism. Enlightenment became a product. Healing was sold like a luxury service. Wisdom? That came in packages, subscriptions, and exclusive content. Their entire platform became a business model disguised as a spiritual mission. Yet, what shook you most was how they subtly disconnected people from their own inner knowing. With love bombing on one hand and gaslighting on the other, they trained people to second-guess their instincts, to trade their intuition for the leader's approval. What looked like empowerment was covert dependency. What sounded like liberation was actually control in costume. You outgrew their narrative, and you did it unapologetically. They had cast you in a role that made them comfortable, one where you stayed agreeable, predictable, small. A character that didn't challenge the plot, didn't question the motives, didn't disrupt the flow of admiration they had built. But true growth never waits for permission. And when your evolution no longer fit the part they wrote for you, your very presence became a disruption. Your expansion shook the foundation of their story, not because you were wrong, but because you stopped shrinking to fit their script. Your evolution felt like rebellion to them, not because you were defiant, but because your growth disrupted their ability to control the narrative. The moment you stopped shrinking to fit their comfort, their grip on the storyline unraveled. You weren't trying to challenge their authority. You were simply stepping into the fullness of who you were always meant to be. But for those who had emotionally and energetically invested in your smaller version, your authentic expansion felt like betrayal. They didn't see your healing as beautiful, they saw it as disobedience. Yet with independence came a different kind of challenge, one that wasn't external but internal. As you stepped away from the stage, stripped of the familiar scripts, roles, and applause, you found yourself in a vast wilderness of uncertainty. The identity that had been shaped to please others no longer applied, and in its absence, you were left to rediscover your own truth. Without the constant validation, without the community that once defined you, you were faced with the essential question: who am I beneath all this conditioning? This part of the journey brought with it a strange, sacred blend of grief and relief. You grieved the sense of belonging, even though you knew that belonging had only existed under the condition of your compliance. You mourned the friendships that fell apart in the light of your growth, relationships that in hindsight had never embraced your real self. You felt sorrow for the dreams you had built on the shaky ground of illusion. And yet, woven into that grief was a soft and steady current of peace. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, you weren't performing. You weren't censoring your truth or diluting your power for the comfort of others. You weren't walking on emotional eggshells, managing everyone else's reactions just to be accepted. You were simply existing, unfiltered, unapologetic, and free. And within that raw simplicity, you discovered a deeper truth. This entire journey through deception and disillusionment had never been punishment. It was preparation. Every lie you uncovered trained your eyes to recognize the truth with precision. Every manipulation you survived forged stronger boundaries. Every mask you witnessed reminded you of the priceless value of authenticity. The chaos had crafted clarity. The betrayal had built discernment. And now, as you stand at this powerful point of convergence, everything that once seemed fragmented suddenly connects. The personal, the social, the systemic, all those threads of awareness merge into a single undeniable truth. Your sensitivity wasn't a flaw. It wasn't overthinking. It was your armor. It made you ready. You now see that the performance you encountered wasn't limited to a single group or community. It was a global operating system, a default way of being in a world terrified of truth. The collapse you felt coming was never a coincidence. It was coded into the very structure of what had been built. Now, as everything around you begins to fall, just as you always sensed it would. You are not panicked. You are not searching for explanations. You've been holding the truth quietly, faithfully the entire time. You didn't just predict the collapse, you understood the faulty foundation it was built upon. While others were mesmerized by the glamour, the pace, and the noise, you were listening to the silence beneath it all. You were watching the scaffolding, noticing the missing support beams, the compromised structures. And you knew the truth. Anything built on avoidance will eventually crumble. This isn't a surprise. It's the result of a collective choice, a culture that idolized image over integrity, denied reality in favor of illusion, and silenced the very questions that might have saved it. And now, as the dust begins to rise and the mask finally slips, you remain rooted, not in shock but in certainty. Because you always knew. You always saw. You saw it in the cracks they tried to conceal, in every strained smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, in every convenient silence that replaced meaningful conversation. You felt it in the way people used phrases like, "stay positive," as a weapon to silence real concerns, as if truth was somehow threatening to the image they were clinging to. You weren't being negative, you were grounded, you weren't wallowing in fear, you were anchored in reality. You understood something most refused to acknowledge. That momentum without foundation always succumbs to gravity. That speed without direction is a setup for disaster. And the more they cheered over illusions, the louder the silence underneath became. You weren't hoping for destruction, but you saw it coming. You recognized the architecture of collapse long before the walls began to shake, not because you were manifesting it, but because the blueprint was flawed from the very beginning, and your spirit could read it like a map. You didn't need closure. Closure implies an open conversation, a respectful ending, a shared acknowledgement of what was and what went wrong. But you realize that closure is often a disguised tether, another way to keep you looped into a story that has already concluded. You weren't standing at any doors waiting for apologies or long overdue explanations. You weren't looking to be validated by those who had already rewritten the past in order to soothe their own guilt. What you longed for in the quiet corners of your heart was confirmation, that you weren't imagining things, that you weren't being too sensitive, too suspicious, or too intense. You just needed to know that your instincts were sharp, your perception was accurate, and your emotional radar hadn't betrayed you. And freedom arrived the moment you stopped asking others to confirm what your soul already knew. That was when you understood that truth doesn't always arrive wrapped in conversations. Sometimes it reveals itself silently, through patterns, through absence, through the gradual decay of falsehood. You stopped chasing clarity from those who were busy building new illusions. You stopped hoping for transparency from people who had made deception a habit. Instead, you began to trust that truth has its own rhythm, its own way of unfolding, and that your job was not to force it, but to stay in alignment until it revealed itself. You no longer needed someone to return and confess. You only needed to stay still long enough to witness what happens when masks slip and performances end. And now, that moment has come. Without you lifting a finger, without raising your voice, without trying to prove anything, the truth is unfolding in plain sight. People are unraveling in the exact ways you once whispered to yourself late at night. The facades are cracking, the characters are breaking, and the carefully scripted narratives are falling apart. As the lights dim and the audience disappears, the real selves emerge, uncensored, unguarded, and undeniable. And in those raw revelations, you are receiving your confirmation. But this confirmation isn't just validation. It's initiation. It brings with it a quiet responsibility that you're only now beginning to comprehend. Because now that you've seen the illusion for what it is, now that you've walked through the wilderness of awakening and come out on the other side with your soul and integrity still intact, you carry something rare, something sacred. You carry the ability to help others navigate their own unraveling. You don't need to become a leader in the traditional sense. You've seen the damage performative leadership can cause. You've watched as titles were used to dominate rather than elevate. This journey isn't calling you to rise above others. It's calling you to walk beside them as a living embodiment of what's possible when someone chooses truth over comfort, growth over approval, and authenticity over applause. You're not here to preach. You're here to be, to hold space, to be the quiet light that says, yes, I've been there. Yes, it's terrifying. Yes, it's worth it. Your life, lived in alignment, becomes the message. Your example becomes the map. And in a world still obsessed with appearances, your presence, rooted in truth, becomes revolutionary. Your very existence has become undeniable proof that there is another way to live. A way that doesn't require selling your soul for acceptance, dimming your light for comfort, or conforming to illusions just to be seen. What once felt like an unbearable sensitivity, a burden that isolated you from the world, has revealed itself to be a sacred gift, a form of divine service. Your ability to detect deception isn't paranoia, it's protection, not only for yourself, but for others who haven't yet learned to trust their intuition. The emotional intensity that made you feel too much in shallow spaces is now a healing balm for those who thought their depth was a defect. And your courage to stand alone, especially when it would have been so much easier to follow the crowd, has become a permission slip for others to finally walk away from environments that never honored who they truly were. What you once questioned about yourself, your deep sensitivity, your persistent awareness, your refusal to play along, has all been confirmed as wisdom. The dynamics you observed in silence have exposed themselves as patterns that exist not just in personal relationships, but across collective systems. The cracks you sensed weren't isolated, they were part of a global unraveling. And now, as events unfold exactly as your spirit anticipated, every piece of your awakening has clicked into place, revealing a larger picture you were always meant to see. Your journey through the wilderness wasn't just about your own liberation, it was initiation. It was strength training for the soul, preparing you to hold space for others who would one day find themselves where you once stood, confused, betrayed, and searching for what's real in a world of illusion. You didn't choose to become a bridge between illusion and truth. It happened because you lived the transformation, because you refused to numb yourself into compliance, because you chose clarity when everyone else chose convenience. And now the whispers you once carried in isolation, the intuitive warnings you once second-guessed, are becoming the very words echoing in rooms that are finally ready to hear them. You were never chasing revenge. You weren't desperate for recognition. All you ever wanted was for truth to stand tall on its own, without needing you to drag it, defend it, or explain it to people committed to misunderstanding you. You weren't bitter. You were just early. You weren't divisive. You were clear. And you didn't outgrow people because of ego. You outgrew the performance they required you to participate in. Now you stand in the aftermath, not with arrogance, but with reverence. You're not celebrating being right. You're honoring the courage it took to stay awake in a world built to put you to sleep. You're acknowledging the strength it took to choose growth over acceptance, to walk away from comfortable lies in favor of uncomfortable truths. This isn't the end of the story. This is the beginning of your real story, the one you were born to live. Because now you see your role clearly. You were never meant to save everyone. You were meant to keep the possibility of salvation alive. You weren't called to fix every broken system. You were called to build something better. You weren't chosen to be popular. You were chosen to be real in a world that celebrates masks and rewards the inauthentic. Your sensitivity was never your flaw. It was your superpower. Your deep seeing, your deep feeling, your deep knowing. These are the very things that kept you tethered to truth when the world tried to pull you into illusion. This was never something you needed to overcome. It was something sacred to honor, something divine to embrace, a calling written into your very being. Yes, the community is in shock now. But you're not surprised. Because you were designed to see what others couldn't. You were meant to read the signs that others ignored. Not as punishment, but as preparation. Not as prophecy, but as protection. You are the early warning system in a world that often waits until it's too late. Your presence disrupts illusions and activates awakening, not because you try to, but because that's who you are. Walk forward now, chosen one, not in fear, but in knowing. The world needs your specific vibration, your grounded awakeness, your uncompromising clarity, your untamed truth. They need someone who can see clearly, while everyone else stares through rose-colored lenses. You were never broken by this experience. You were broken open, so that more light could get in, so that more wisdom could be released, so that you could become the vessel you were always meant to be. The ending you witnessed wasn't your downfall. It was the sacred clearing for a new beginning. And what comes next? It needs you. It needs people like you. Those who have the eyes to see through illusion, the heart to love through pain, and the strength to build something that's real, raw, and lasting. Your time of being misunderstood is ending. You are moving into a season of being essential. The very traits that once made you an outsider now make you a pioneer. Step into this role not with hesitation, but with confidence. Because every betrayal, every awakening, every lonely night, and every quiet truth was shaping you for this exact moment. The truth doesn't need permission to arrive. It only needs one brave soul to recognize it, and another to echo it, and another to live it out loud. That brave soul has always been you. It still is, and it always will be. That's all for today. Dear Father, I pray for the growth of my faith. Help me trust you even when physical evidence is lacking. Let me believe in your perpetual presence, knowing you will never harm me. I understand that your thoughts for me are thoughts of prosperity and not harm to give me a good future. Thank you, gracious and eternal Father, for always listening to my voice. I offer up this prayer to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. Thank you, Jesus, for your love and provision. I am grateful for your presence in my life and the abundance you bring. If this video resonated with you, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with those who need to hear this message. Leave a comment below about your journey and how you are preparing for your own triumphant return. If you'd like to support our work, please consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. This helps us continually improve our content to offer you the best. The link to Buy Me a Coffee is in the description. No gift is too small. Whether it's a penny, a prayer, or a share, your generosity helps spread God's word and brings hope to others. Don't stop here. Watch our next video for powerful revelations about the signs that reveal you are the chosen one. We've enjoyed following this spiritual journey with you. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Keep shining brightly and embrace your destiny with courage. See you next time. Blessings to all the beautiful souls from the Enlighten wisdom.